Okay, so good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second talk, Norwegian Woods and Irish Hills, a blueprint for the reforesting of Ireland's degraded uplands. This is a talk by Dr. Duncan Halley, and we are delighted to have him, as well as Larkin O'Toole and Bridgie Murphy, as our guests, and of course Andrew, who is the visionary who is bringing all of this together for the purpose of bringing Ireland back to her beautiful forested wooded self. I'm going to invite Andrew to introduce our speaker and our panelists, and I hope you have a great evening. And yes. Andrew.
Okay, thank you, Joanna, and thank you for both webinars and all your help. And yeah, it's great to have Dr. Duncan here. And you know, we would have connected with him through Larkin O'Toole, through the Golden Eagle Trust a few years ago, and he came over and gave this presentation in 2016, and it was pretty amazing to see. And also. It's great, you know, great to have his expertise and experience working in Central Europe and other restoration projects. Also good, you know, good to have Bridgie and Larkin. Bridgie's experience in kind of with between Ireland and Southern Africa, and working with agrarian and land reform, women's rights, and also community social justice issues. And Larkin's experience in conservation over many years here in the UK. And I think, if I'm correct, Larkin's connection with Duncan is through the Golden Eagle, the reintroduction of the eagle, if I'm not mistaken. So look, brilliant to have them here, and look forward to, you know, this presentation, and also for a good debate afterwards, and you know, follow up of maybe some actions. So just before we start, though, with what's happened in Donegal and Creeslough, we'd just like to ask for 1 minute silence in solidarity with the community of Creeslough. Thank you for that. And also, I'd just like to thank CELT and the Department of Agriculture, where the funding for these webinars has come from. And CELT and the Woodland League are working in partnership on forest restoration for your workshops, trainings, etc. over many years. So big thank you there as well. So look, off you go, Duncan, and we look forward to having you again. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be back. This is an update of a talk originally given in 2016, if I remember, in Dublin, but I've attempted to update it and add some extra information where it's pertinent. My connection with Ireland is partly through these kinds of issues, and also as part of the Norwegian end of the White-tailed sea eagle reintroduction project. And I was last in Ireland a few months ago to actually see some of our birds released, which was very nice after 3 years of COVID restrictions. So to the talk, I will now share my screen. Is that visible? Yes, good. So my subject tonight is what's often called temperate rainforest, which is in some ways a way of an advertising thing to get people interested in it because everyone knows about tropical rainforests. It simply means temperate woodlands in places that are wet, like Ireland and like Norway. And to look at the potential for upland forest restoration in Ireland, and not just the potential for upland forest restoration in Ireland, but the potential of that forest in other respects. I should say that I work for the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. We're an independent, not-for-profit institute, and we work in things like fish and game management, monitoring, biodiversity, ecosystem services, sustainability, and community development. And we are the main institution covering those areas in Norway. I've been here since 1993, and I'm a Norwegian citizen these days. Before we get going, a couple of geographical definitions. Norway is a big place. It's the size of the island of Great Britain and Ireland put together, and it's strung out over a very long range of latitudes. So just to be precise in what I'm talking about, when I say southwest of Norway, I mean this area on the left. It's about a bit over 33,000 square kilometers, which would make it about twice the size of Connaught. Sometimes I talk about West Norway because statistics sometimes come in that form and I can't disaggregate them. And when I say West Norway, I mean the area on the right, which is nearly 60,000 square kilometers, which makes it about 3/4 the size of the island of Ireland. Now, even though we are further north, in fact, our climate is really quite similar in these western and southwestern areas to Ireland. It's a little bit colder in the winter, but nevertheless, over large areas, it's above zero, even in January. So very little snow, lots of rain. And in July, the temperatures are really actually quite similar. The reason for this, of course, is that both places you're dominated by the effects of the Gulf Stream immediately offshore. Compared with Ireland, we are very considerably wetter. In the part of Norway we're talking about, the Irish rainfall band, top right there, the top band is greater than 2,400 millimeters. And in Norway, that's only the fourth of 6 bands. Our highest band is above 4,000. So in some ways, our climate is even more unpleasant than that of Ireland, and therefore, in many ways, relatively more difficult for trees to grow. It should be relatively easier for trees in upland areas of Ireland to recover than is the case in Norway, given the starting conditions. So both areas were, of course, before the Neolithic, heavily wooded right up to the climatic tree line. In both places, the Neolithic arrived around about the same time, and along with it, agriculture and grazing of livestock. And over the next several thousand years, it led to the deforestation of most of the land cover in Western Ireland, in the upland areas of Ireland, in upland Scotland, in Norway. The same kind of people with the same sorts of technologies, doing the same sorts of things, and with the same sort of effects. So in Ireland or in Scotland, you can often find in peat bogs, you'll find big old roots of big trees, and that's exactly the same case in the west of Norway. And here are 3 scenes from the southwest of Norway in the early part of the 20th century. And it looks very reminiscent of areas in Western Ireland, even to this day. There are, in the top left, you can see enormous dry stone dikes that were built for miles and miles across the terrain because there was no wood for fencing. And the entire landscape is deforested, rough grazing, sometimes with a few copses of birch, especially in places that are difficult for grazers to reach. And people responded in much the same way. Two of these photographs are from Norway, one's from Ireland and one is from Scotland. And if it wasn't for the watermarks in some of these pictures, I think it'd be really rather hard to tell which was which. In fact, the top left is from Ireland, top right is from the West Highlands of Scotland, and the other two are from Western Norway, and they're all from the first half of the 20th century. And people also responded by building from local materials in the same way. These are three houses from the early 20th century. The top one's in Scotland, in Uist in the Outer Isles. The middle one is from the southwest of Norway, and the bottom one is County Mayo. So we're talking about similar places which have had similar effects on them of similar use over a period of some thousands of years, which resulted in all of them being deforested to a very substantial extent. Well over 90% of the original forest cover was gone. And in Norway, peat extraction, sometimes like in Ireland, was on an industrial scale. This is a peat extraction area on the island of Fedje, and the peat was taken on a small railway to the coast and then transported from there to Bergen, which is the main industrial centre on the coast of Western Norway, and it was the main source of domestic and industrial fuel. So the landscape really looks pretty similar to places in Western Ireland that I've seen, like in Donegal or in Clare. That's Fidjedalen in the extreme southwest of Norway, or rather that's Fidjedalen getting on for a century ago. The bottom picture is what it looks like now, and every tree in that picture regenerated through natural regeneration, apart from 2 or 3 fruit trees, which are right in by the farm that you see in the middle of the picture there. So there's been an enormous amount of regeneration. This is not an isolated event in Norway. Here's Geirangerfjord. The top left picture is 1885, and it's worth looking especially at the mountain in the background there. There are large areas that are completely lacking in any soil. They're just flat, slabby, open rock. But already by 1960, they were covered in woodland. And that's even more the case in 2004. What seems to have happened is that the regenerating woodland, which in the first generation is mostly birch and aspen, because both of them have highly mobile wind-blown seeds, they worked in on the sides of the rocks by clinging onto each other's roots, and eventually they managed to cover the slabby open rock in vegetation and of course the soil underneath that vegetation. So when we're thinking of carbon sequestration terms, that area is now sequestering many hundreds, thousands of tons of carbon, when previously it sequestered absolutely nothing. There's another place, Oslibacken. You've seen this picture before. That's what it looked like in the early 20th century. And this is what it looks like now. Now, the perspective isn't quite the same. If you took the picture in top left was taken where the orange cross is in the second picture, you have to go up to the top of the mountain where there's a little cliff now in order to see the landscape because of all the regrowth. And you can see the landscape has changed a great deal. There's some plantation forestry in the middle distance, but all of the woodland in the foreground has regenerated by natural means. This is Fonnes, which is right on the coast, very windy location. And in this case, we know really quite a lot about it. The pines there were planted in 1907, and of course were fenced off to keep the grazing animals off. And we know that the grazing pressure was reduced from 1975, and what you see at the bottom there is the result of that only 30 years later. The Pine trees there have provided the seed source for nearly all the regrowth there, but there are some deciduous trees moving in again. The area that's left open in the foreground there is an area of bog that is so wet that trees can't grow on it. The shed in the top picture, by the way, is about 2 meters tall at the ridge of the roof, which will give you a perspective for how tall the trees are there. So you can in fact get a pretty large effect in really quite a small period of time. That's been very much the experience of regeneration in Norway over the last 60, 70 years. And this can go out to really quite places that certainly when I give talks on this in Scotland, people find really rather unbelievable. The red dot there is a skerry off the coast of mid-Norway. It's exposed to the full range of Atlantic gales with no shelter whatsoever. And that's a photograph from our sea eagle reintroduction project, first phase, where we're collecting a sea eagle from the top of that tree, which is maybe 6-7 meters high. It is being affected by the wind. That's why it's relatively small, but it is nevertheless growing there in a place which in Scotland and perhaps in Ireland, people would think was just quite impossible for a tree to grow in. So over the course of the last century, we've had a tripling in the woodland area or rather in the woodland volume. Most of our statistics come as volume because when the statistics series was invented, it was production of timber. Back in 1933, it was seriously believed in Norway that the entire country would fairly shortly be completely deforested. There had been a lot of extractive felling out on the west coast. Of course, the woodland had been gone for a long, long time, but even in the inland areas, it was fast disappearing, in that case due to commercial logging, and measures were taken to reverse this. So in Norway as a whole, over the last century, the resource has tripled in volume terms. Now the spruce and pine increases, those were partly through natural regeneration and partly through planting. Deciduous, we don't grow deciduous trees commercially in Norway. The deciduous growth there, which is a tripling over the period as well, that's almost entirely through natural regeneration. None of those trees were planted. Over the same time, the amount of trees that were conifers that were planted has really gone down. In the early period, planting was relatively common. And here we're talking specifically about Western Norway. But now natural regeneration dominates even in purely commercial forestry stands. And when it comes to farmer-owned woodland, which is well over 80% of the woodland in West Norway, it's almost all regenerated naturally. And in fact, it's a legal requirement that all owners ensure adequate regeneration of woodland following any harvest. And it should also be said that we never use deer fencing, certainly not to keep them out. They're used on deer farms to keep them in, and we sometimes use them to keep deer off roads. But for the purpose of stopping deer from eating trees, deer fencing is never used. And the future appears to be even more of the same. This is a study done in 2007, where they looked at the amount of natural regeneration that was actually there. That's the light green color, and then the potential natural forest regeneration, which is the darker green color. But much of that woodland was really, the darker green color was really already incipiently there, because their definition of a woodland was where the trees are over 2.5 meters high, and there were an awful lot of small trees. And in the interim, a great deal of that regeneration has in fact happened. So we're talking about very large areas here, which is a real landscape scale change. If we go into some numbers on that, here are a couple of areas that are just beginning their transition over from moorland into woodland again. From 63 to 93, the total area of forest classified as productive increased by 55%. Just as an aside, that's a forestry statistics term. It just means that the timber volume potentially grows at over 1 cubic meter per hectare per year, whether or not it's harvested for timber. We do our forestry inventories in a 5-year rolling program. And between the 2005 to 2009, 2010 to 14, the annualized increase was in West Norway was 305 square kilometers of new woodland a year, or 2.6% of the land area over 5 years. Almost all of the expansion was through natural regeneration. I should say that looks like that's starting to slow down now. The reason it's starting to slow down is it's running out of places to go to. The area of woodland in West Norway increased by over 1,000 kilometers square between 2005 and 2012. And the volume of deciduous timber has more than doubled over the last 20 years. So this is an absolutely enormous, rampant process. It's huge. I've been in Norway now for 29 years, and it's a hugely visible process. If you look at pictures between the times, if you live here, of course, it kind of creeps up on you. But even then, it's a big, obvious feature of the landscape. Don't need to look at these graphs particularly. They're just the basis for the calculation. If you look at the standard, the annualized increase in timber volume, it amounts to nearly 4 million cubic meters a year. This is in West Norway. If you use the increased ratio of spruce pine to deciduous and the UK Forestry Commission conversion factors, this translates into an annual sequestration of almost exactly 1 million tons of carbon. That translates to 3.63 million tons of carbon dioxide, which are being sequestered every year by this volume increase. Now, the EU these days auctions emission permits. And so you could say that that amounts to what the price of a ton of carbon dioxide is. This is notional when it comes to carbon sinking, but the last auction was on the 6th of October, and there it was 65 euros a ton. If you do the sum, that amounts to notionally 236 million euros of carbon being sunk in West Norway alone every year. And that doesn't include the bark, branches, leaves, root system, and soil carbon, which is probably most of it. That's only the timber increase. So it's actually pretty significant. And if you were able to monetize sinking the same way that you do for discharge of carbon, it would be worth a very great deal of money indeed. So all of this has been happening. It's huge. Why is it happening? A great deal of research has been done on this, and the answer is entirely clear, and it's very simple. It's reductions in grazing pressure. That's what has produced this effect. And we can even quantify it from 1949. You can calculate the metabolic biomass of all large herbivores, meaning the metabolically active parts of their body, in terms of kilograms per kilometer squared. In the period from 49 to 69, the numbers of livestock were declining rapidly in Norway for the usual social reasons. People were leaving difficult hill farms and moving to new jobs in areas that had the electricity and had the schools and so on. And they found that making a living that way was less hard than hill farming. So you got this very large decline in domestic herbivores. Since 69, we've had an increase in the metabolic biomass, but that's pretty much entirely through an increase in the number of deer. They've been coming back as the domestic livestock have been disappearing. And partly because deer are more biased towards browsing, but mostly because there is more browse to be had in the diet, the proportion of browse in the diet of all large herbivores has been increasing as the amount of trees in the landscape has increased. So, summary, this is really for people that are reading this presentation later on. The reason that West Norway became deforested was in exactly the same reasons that happened in other highly oceanic parts of Western Europe. It was the impact of human land use practices in a climate of that kind. And it's happened over a long time. It began in the Neolithic, and for most areas of Northwest Europe, it was complete by around about the Bronze Age. Then in just the last century, it's been coming back in Southwest Norway because of social and economic changes. None of this was planned, and as far as the deciduous element was concerned, none of it was planted. And nowadays in West Norway, 90% of the West Coast moorland, which existed in the 19th century, some of it's become arable or improved pasture, but mostly it's become woodland. And the data indicates that the timing of woodland regeneration was, and still is, primarily affected by proximity to the nearest seed source. It's been a kind of snowballing effect. To begin with in the landscape, there was little in the way of seed. Then as time goes by, there's more and more seed, and you get we've been getting a rapidly increasing rate of regrowth. This is now starting to slow because it's running out of new areas to move into. And another point that's probably worth emphasizing is that most of this new woodland is of an open structure. It has a rich understory which remains. It's suitable for purposes like livestock grazing at moderate densities, and most of it is so used. In Ireland, perhaps people are used to woodland largely being in uplands especially, largely being densely planted blocks. And there can sometimes be an unconscious thought that all woodlands like that, and therefore if the landscape is rewooded, it's essentially going to be a giant plantation of tight trees with not much of an understory. But the natural form of woodland in these areas is a pretty open structure. So let's look at some of those areas. This is Chelos in the southwest of Norway. It's the cabin in the foreground, which you can perhaps see, is at 352 meters above sea level. And you can see it's a very well wooded area. But if you dig into the records, there are 3 old hill farms in this landscape. The cabin there is built on the remains of one of the old farmhouses, which burned down sometime in the 1950s. And in the background at Voskeland, the old hill farm is still being used as a holiday home. The areas that were most in by, like the area at Chelos there, they are still to some degree open because those are fertilized for many centuries and they make an excellent grazing lawn, and the various herbivores that are still in this area, wild and domestic, then tend to target that area, and that keeps that area open as a glade. But 50, 60 years ago, the entire landscape you see there was quite open. It is still used. The farmers still live here, but they live down in the valley now. They don't live in hill farms up on the hill, and they transport their livestock up there using vehicles in the spring. This is Mon and Fidjadalen. You've seen this picture before. The Glenfort farmhouse is about just over 300 meters above sea level. And again, you see the same grazing lawn effect created by the old arable inbuy. We know quite a lot about Mon. There it is on the map, top left. Above it, above that cliff, is a place called Monamura, which means Mon's bog. It's at 580 meters. And there's an oral history from a man called Per Ostebø, who lived there until 1914. That's when the farm went out of use as a hill farm. And to quote, peat they took among other places from Monamura. Per relates that they found the roots of large trees up there. Of course, the reason they went all that way up there to get peat was the complete lack of woodland in the glen, or indeed up on the tops, apart from some trees that were clinging to inaccessible cliffs, which provided most of the initial seed source. So here it is again today. Again, it's still a used landscape. I once had a conversation with the farmer at Eikeskogen, who lives underneath the glen here and farms it. He lets out almost exactly 1,000, is a direct quote, of this kind of sheep. It's called a Dalarna sheep. It's maybe about twice the size of a black shaved-faced sheep. They're turned out to graze here in the summer. They graze in the glen and in the surrounding hills, but the overall density is not enough to inhibit regrowth, except perhaps in this grazing lawn area where they tend to congregate, especially in the autumn when they're coming down from the higher ground. Another aspect you can see at Fidjidalen is that woodland is quite capable of directly recolonizing open scree. Most of the scree areas in Norway are just being swallowed up. I've seen in academic papers from Scotland, for example, an assertion that scree is a natural feature of the mountain landscape. That's not really true, at least not below the climatic tree line. A lot of in fact, all of these scree slopes are being actively colonized by woodland. Here you're seeing it when it's maybe 3/4 of the way complete. And the trees stabilize the rocks, the stones, and they create a new soil layer and hold down the whole area. And it reduces, among other things, the incidence of landslips. So here we go to Hidrosund. This is right on the coast. It faces southwest and it's directly exposed to the full force of North Sea winds. It too was, and there is pollen and other data to prove it, a completely deforested area for several millennia. It's a very windy spot. The mean annual wind speed at Eigerøya, just up the coast, is 8 meters per second, and it gets force 11 to force 12 winds directly on shore out of the southwest every winter, pretty much every winter. Nevertheless, it's still wooded. So sometimes you'll hear that one of the problems for regeneration is the wind, but this place is windier than anywhere at sea level in Scotland. Certainly, I don't know the statistics for Ireland, but I suspect that would be the same case there. Here's an old dry-stone farmhouse with recently regenerated woodland in the background. And the woodland actually these days gets right out to the edge of the splash zone. You can see in the top there at Kirkehaven, you can see the church. It's just visible at the bottom towards the top right of the picture to give you an idea of scale. So you can see that the breakers coming off the sea are very substantial here. That island in the foreground is called Dragøya, and it's the last island. There's nothing between it and the full width of the North Sea, and it faces directly southwest. But the moment you're outside the splash zone, woodland has regenerated there as well. So there are really very few places, in the absence of heavy grazing and things like muir burn and collection of wood for firewood, which won't regenerate when they're given the chance, and none of the trees on Dragøya were ever planted. That's all come back through natural regeneration. And we're beginning now in these places. This Hydrosund was one of the first places to get a big drop in grazing pressures, partly because of its proximity to the coast, which meant proximity to emigrant ships, which took a lot of Norwegians, proportionately even more than Ireland, it is claimed, to the New World starting in the 1860s. So they had a big drop in populations there, a big drop in grazing. In particular, it was the shepherds and other people who did the less attractive work in this area that tended to leave for places like Minnesota. So, so they've had quite a long time of regeneration here. And you're beginning to see succession. The first trees in were mostly birch and aspen because they have, and rowan, they have wind or bird moved seeds. But you're beginning to see a lot of recent succession of oak and hazel. And like much of the west coast of Ireland, pollen indicates that oak hazel forest was a prominent feature of the original natural vegetation. And here they are coming back now. What seems to be behind this is that with the arrival of the birch woodland, it also led to the return of birds like jays, which had previously been extinct in the area because of the lack of woodland. Jays are famous for transporting large seeds around and burying them for winter food stores, and they're the main transport mechanism for trees like birch and aspen. They're back now, and we're beginning to see the effects of that with oak and hazel, some of which were left clinging to cliffs, and farmhouses sometimes had a big oak tree in close by because they kept them for amenity reasons, and also because the acorns were useful for feeding pigs and other animals. And they're now spreading back again out into the landscape. It's worth mentioning perhaps at this point that there does seem some ground to back up the view that is often stated, and there's a lot of data for it, that woodland cover restoration is useful for making milder the effects of droughts and floods. This is Storm Desmond. It affected Ireland and North England, South Scotland, 4 to 6 December 2015. And the same system picked up steam again as it crossed the North Sea and hit the southwest of Norway 18 hours after its onset in Great Britain. Temperatures were above zero in all the areas throughout, except a few mountain peaks, so it all fell as rain, and it fell on ground already wet from a wet November, both in Britain, Ireland, and in southwest Norway. So in the month running up, you can see the precipitation levels in the southwest of Norway there. They're 175, 200% of normal over much of the area. And then there was Storm Desmond, Sune in Norway, which dumped an enormous amount of water over a very short time in the same area. In Ireland, this caused a very great deal of damage. It's expected to run into millions of euro. I have not been able to locate any actual numbers on that, so I have to give you the numbers for South Scotland, Northern England. The main flood damage area in Great Britain was Northern England and Southern Scotland, which is also an area which is extremely deforested. And the rainfall, accumulated rainfall, the highest band there is over 90 millimeters. When the same system arrived in Norway, it dumped a very great deal more. The data comes in 24-hour periods from 7 in the morning to 7 the next day, which is why I have to show you two maps. But even on the first of the days, the 7th, it was over 150 millimeters in that day. And then the next day, it was over 150 millimeters in some places. Overall, it was certainly exceeding 200 millimeters over very wide areas of southwest Norway, when the largest band in Britain and Ireland was 90. So this was a much bigger event. So then if you do a bit of number crunching, this is fairly back of the envelope, and look at the areas, which are broadly similar, the population is rather lower in southwest Norway, about half the size, though most of the population in Lancashire, Cumbria, in that area is concentrated in a few cities in Lancashire. But if you look at the insurance claims, in the UK, they were over 800 million euros. In Norway, they were 31 million euros. That amounts to 289 euros per person in the British areas and 30 euros per person in the Norwegian areas. And it's worth mentioning that your average Norwegian has more stuff than your average British person. So if this was a murder mystery, the prime suspect for what was causing that is the difference for a much bigger event causing very much less damage is the extent of woodland cover. Woodland in southwest Norway is broadly distributed now. There's very little of it in North England and South Scotland. And comparative research, which I have tried to encourage hydrologists to do, the data is abundant, would be very useful here. So far, I have been unable to persuade anyone to do it. If you know anyone out there who is a hydrologist, who would like to do a Marie Curie 2-year postdoc, I think this is one that pretty much writes itself. So if you know someone who's a really good recent PhD who'd like to visit Norway for 2 years and mine the data in all of these countries, I would be very interested to host them. I had a quick look at flooding in Ireland, and there has been some talk recently about this kind of effect. But if you go to the Flooding Ireland website and you put the word woodland into its collection of documents, you find no results whatsoever. I looked through the whole website, and woodland, it says floods are a natural and inevitable part of life in Ireland. I think that may possibly be something of an exaggeration. If the island of Ireland were still as wooded as it was 5,000 years ago, I think flooding would be very much less common than it is today. And it's an area that at the moment does not appear to be hugely appreciated, at least in official Ireland, as far as one can determine from looking at the Irish government websites on the subject. Another thing that woodland regrowth affects is wind. This is a place fairly near me. You can see that a couple of the big thick pines there, this is an upland place, 300 meters above sea level, but at the latitude concerned, that's more like 600 meters in Irish climate. There are these thick squat trees that are bent over really quite hard. And then there's a whole collection of other trees that are growing straight. The reason for this is if you look at old pictures of this area, you had what are Scots called granny pines scattered over an area of mostly open moorland 100 years ago. And they were each facing the full force of the winds at that time. But then the entire landscape has roughened up in between times through regrowth of woodland. As a result, the realized wind strength is very much less through mutual shelter, which has meant that the children of these trees have been able to grow straight instead of bent over. And that has a lot of knock-on effects for the wider environment and for species diversity. So we have in Norway, we've got our woodlands in these coastal oceanic areas. They're pretty much back now. They're used, they're not unoccupied wilderness. And in fact, the population on the land in southwest Norway is a large multiple of that in Scotland. I'm not sure of the case with Ireland. One thing to mention is that farming, the word actually used in Norway is landbruk, which translates literally as land use. It has a wider meaning than is often meant by the term farming, certainly in Great Britain and I think in Ireland as well. It also includes using woodland. It includes things like hunting and gathering. Farming has historically always devoted itself to value creation from all available natural resources. So farmers in Norway are used to using the landscape in a diversified, multiple kind of way, except in arable fields like the one in the middle of this picture. It's very rare for a bit of ground to be used for a single purpose, like, for example, commercial forestry aimed at producing timber and nothing else. The woodland is pretty much all used for multiple income streams. Ownership is pretty dispersed in Norway, nearly 200,000 people out of a population of 5 million at that time were woodland proprietors in Norway. The average property is 58 hectares of productive woodland. They might have other stuff as well that's counted as, quote, unproductive, which means it produces less than a cubic meter of growth per hectare per year. Pretty much all owned by private individuals. 97% of the owners are private, 80% of the area is owned by private individuals. And that's Norway as a whole. The west coast, the number is even higher. And forestry employs 3,900 full-time equivalents in direct timber harvesting and 22,000 full-time equivalents in the wider business. But it's also important to notice that farm woodland employs 5,400 full-time equivalents in non-forestry activities. That's more than in the forestry ones. And that doesn't include livestock grazing, which is an important element. The reason we can't include livestock grazing is that they're simply let out into the environment. And they may be in the woodland, they may be in areas that are not wooded. We can't say that, so we can't put livestock grazing into the statistics. And most of it is owned by people who live locally. A commune in Norway is a pretty small government district. It'd be something akin to the size of a parish in Ireland. It's got a population in rural areas of, the smallest ones only a few hundred, but typically between about 2,000 and 10,000 people. And communes have a serious amount of power. But for our purposes in this, it's to show this is a typical commune in Norway, and getting on for 80% of the woodland resource there is owned by people who live immediately locally. But they've got these very small areas. How they use them for timber purposes is by getting together in forestry cooperatives. That allows them, they're regional, these are the main regional ones listed on the left. This allows investment in modern machinery and other economies of scale for harvesting point of view, but all the other purposes, the landowner exploits them individually. You don't have to join these, it's voluntary, but most farmers find it in their interest to do that. And they come to an agreement with the cooperative, which they themselves are part owners of, as to how the harvesting will be managed. And this is just a statistic on the income, which is a reasonable income for most people in their whole farming operation. But they also get a lot of income from these woodlands, which are mostly semi-natural, from other sources. These are the non-timber incomes for 2007. It's been more difficult to extract this information later since, unfortunately, but it's going to be roughly the same, rather larger now because there's rather more woodland, and prices will have gone up with the general trend in inflation, but the pie is going to be about the same. This is data for all of Norway. So you get a lot of money for sale of hunting and fishing rights, which are owned by the landowner, i.e. the farmer. Owner occupation is legally required in Norway. Management for hunting and fishing 3%, if that's for those people who have leased out the hunting and fishing to someone else for a period. Cabins are a big thing in Norway. We'll get to them later. Cabin rental and sale of cabin plots are both large elements of the income stream. Christmas trees even are small but significant. And there's other income, and that importantly includes fuel wood. And these bring in a lot of money. In total, it brought in 110 million euros a year. That doesn't include the grazing of domestic stock. And it doesn't include the timber harvest. So it's a serious source of income from all of these other elements. So another recap, the area has been deforested pretty much since the Bronze Age, reforested through natural regeneration, especially since the 50s. And it's been a result of reductions in grazing intensities and associated land uses like muir burn. The process is continuing to this day, both in terms of area and in woodland structure. And it includes on hard and fertile rock types in very wet, mild, windy ocean edge locations. But it was, and it is, a working cultural landscape. Land use in it is diversified, with multiple income streams coming from the same bits of land. And the natural regeneration of woodlands integrated into this pattern, and indeed making sure that regeneration happens after timber harvest is a legal requirement. Most land is privately owned. Most land brook, land use farming properties are an element in a wider farming income. So looking at how all this works in management, some of it is in clear fell rotation for timber as its primary use, though virtually always there will be, for example, some hunting going on. But most of it is in mixed use for timber, firewood, grazing, hunting, and forest products. You can see there's been a little area taken out towards the right of this picture, but most of the rest of it is still intact, and there's a mix of deciduous and coniferous timber. The deciduous timber is used to some extent for firewood, which is completely replaced peat in Norway. There are some places on the coast we're still digging peat into the 1980s, but that's pretty much gone now. And in this form of management, which is called plukkehugst in Norwegian, which literally means pluck harvesting, it's a thing the farmer does largely in winter when he hasn't got much else to do. And then he'll select individual trees from this landscape, drag them down to the nearest roadway, and then in the spring someone will come along with a truck and take it away. And it results in a varied continuous cover woodland structure, which is useful for all the other income streams that the farmer wants. The farmers also tend to prefer this because instead of one payday every 60 years or so when you do a complete clear fell, they have a pretty much continuous stream from the timber, and they have all of these other sources of income as well. They can graze their livestock inside this matrix, they can go hunting in it, or they can sell the hunting. They can even do things like gathering berries and mushrooms. So there's a lot that they get out of this area in addition to the timber. Grazing remains a big element. Here we are up at the climatic tree line. That's actually at about 850, 900 meters. And that's a farmer friend of mine, Jon Truen. We did some research, collaborative research on sheep grazing once upon a time. So here we are at the top end of the climatic range. There are some of his sheep. And in South West Norway, there are about 500,000 sheep in this out grazing in the summer. Usually they're taken in for the winter, and that's maybe an element in keeping the grazing pressure within limits that stops the regeneration from being reversed by large grazing pressures. There's also cattle. A lot of cattle are grazed openly and in woodland in Norway. And even goats. This is down at Hidrosund again. These are a kind of a niche market. They've become popular in Norway. These are a meat producing species from South Africa called a boer goat, and they attract fancy prices in restaurants. Goats are also milked for goat cheese. They're quite a small element these days, but they are still there. Hunting, big thing in Norway. Hunting, people, it's a very egalitarian pursuit in this country, and most of the hunting for deer and for grouse is in fact done in woodland. The natural habitat of the red grouse is not a completely open moorland. Its natural habitat, the name of the species in the rest of Europe is the willow grouse, because it likes living in these kind of open woodlands towards the upper range, where you get, like in the picture bottom right, you get willow scrub and birch growing in these open associations. That's the main habitat, and that's where most of the hunting is done. You get other forest birds. Black grouse are, I understand, pretty rare in Ireland these days. They're really common here and they're hunted a great deal. Their real core habitat, if you look at the habitat descriptions in Great Britain and Ireland, they tend to say that they're found on open moorlands, maybe with an element of woodland in them, but that's really the only habitats they've got left. Their real core habitat is this kind of open woodland, and in it they are the commonest grouse of all, except at the upper levels where it's willow grouse. And we also have capercaillie and hazel hen, and these are all hunted in season. There are hares, same species as the Irish hare. And of course, deer, mostly in the southwest of Norway, red and roe, which are hunted again in these woodland habitats primarily. And just as I said, it's an egalitarian thing, and it's also a major source of income for rural landowners, though they often go hunting themselves. The first winter I was in Norway, I lived with a farming family, and it was they had young children, and their father had knocked over a red deer and a roe deer, and 2 or 3 times a week it was venison. The kids were complaining, not venison again. It was really, for farming families, it is a major part of their diet. This is some data mostly about the Scottish Highlands. I'll go through it fairly quickly. The deer in Norway, and I've seen red deer in Ireland as well. I think this is also true of Ireland. The deer in southwest Norway are very much larger. They're about 40% larger on the average, and we know that it isn't for genetic reasons. It's to do with the quality of the environment. The areas they live in are very exposed, and the sward is very poor in Scotland, whereas in Norway, the sward they're eating is of very much higher quality plants in this open woodland understory, and they're much more sheltered from the weather, and it produces a very much larger animal. And the data, genetic and from moving animals around, is entirely clear that this is due to their nutrition. The ones in Scotland are literally nutritionally stunted. And you can see that here. That's the Scottish stags and hinds on the left, Norway in the middle, and UK farmed animals, which are pretty much of Scottish stock, on the right. When you look at actual extraction levels, the number of animals that are being taken out from your average Norwegian area per unit area per year are pretty much the same as in a pure play Scottish red deer hunting estate, which does nothing but hunt red deer. Though the venison amounts are very considerably higher per unit area in Norway, because the animals are very much bigger and they've got larger trophy heads as well. And remember, in Scotland, this area is producing nothing except deer, and in Norway, the area is producing all of these other products that you've seen up to now as well. So this is, excuse me, another recap really for when people read it. One moment. So one question is, how does Norway get the same harvest levels but still get woodland regeneration? It achieves it through harvesting a much larger proportion of the population. We take out about 27% of our deer every year, whereas in Scotland it's 10%, which is not enough to control the population levels. So population densities in areas that have red deer in Scotland are very high, and certainly high enough to inhibit any regeneration, whereas in Norway that's not true. But even then, we are extracting more venison and just as many animals out of the landscape as is the case in Scotland. So our population densities are lower, which allows regeneration, but harvests are sustainably higher. And also, of course, well-nourished deer breed more rapidly, and non-hunting deaths, e.g. winter starvation, which is in fact the main cause of death in Scotland. I don't know about Ireland, but that's vanishingly rare in Norway, even in very hard winters. So we get many but much bigger deer from land which has multiple other economic uses. The Scottish area has essentially stabilized at a very low level of productivity. Or stabilize is not the right word, it's still in the long term going downhill, because too many deer have removed all of the regeneration and all of the palatable plants. So to exaggerate slightly, they're trying to survive on cardboard. Fuel wood, also a large element of the use of these new woodlands. That's my wood burning stove at home, top left. And the top bottom right is my neighbor across the road getting ready for the winter. You can buy machines like this in the local B&Q, which will turn birch logs like the ones on the left into logs ready for drying and then burning, as you can see bottom right. Though the bottom right one is a commercial operation. People don't, people often do it for personal use, but sale is also a large element. So in the farm top left there, you can see their hills at the back. Their strategy here is they're going for a clear felling system. And when they've clear felled, they let it regenerate naturally. That produces a big pulse of birch regeneration. And that birch is then thinned out and taken away about 20 years later to make the fuel wood you see at the front, which then goes for sale. And while they leave the regenerated spruce to grow on into a timber crop, and they rotate that around their area of hills, which is 4 or 5 square kilometers over the course of the cycle that works best for them. And the patches of conifer forest provide good shelter in the winter. The patches of birch provide good grazing for deer and for sheep, and are also used by, it's also a good matrix for forest grouse, which are also hunted. If you look at some sums on this, again, the data series ended, unfortunately, back in 2009. So this is the last time I've got data for this. The average household in Norway uses 816 kilograms. This yields 7.29 terawatt hours, which is about as much as a very, very big nuclear power station. And the declared income from fuel wood sales is 323 million kroner, or 40 million euros. And the reason I say declared income is my experience has been that this is normally a strictly cash transaction whenever I buy my wood. And I suspect a deal of it is possibly not declared. And the fuel wood is not the primary use of any of the land from which it's produced, is also worth saying. Another product you can get out of these areas is gathering berries. I don't think cloudberries, which are the orange ones, are particularly common in Ireland, but all of the other ones are. You can collect them. You can buy these devices seasonally in the supermarkets in Norway, which make collecting things like blueberries quicker, and you can collect large quantities. Mushrooming is another seasonal pursuit. And you can also do artisanal things out of deciduous woodland, like these various pots and jars, for example. Another possible new income source is carbon storage and biodiversity. In Norway, we've just completed an exercise where we have quantified the carbon storage of various Norwegian ecosystems, including woodland. And woodland is typically an efficient sink of carbon, both in the trees themselves, the other biomass they support, and the soils they hold down and deepen. And payments for this are being developed at EU level at the moment. There are plans for international trading mechanisms in carbon storage so that, for example, the Netherlands might pay for carbon sunk in, for example, Galway. The problem is to know how this might work for Ireland. It's going to be very sensitive to the exact way carbon is accounted for and how these schemes are structured. Worst case, they'll turn into some form of greenwash. Best case, they will be a very useful mechanism for regenerating biodiverse woodland in Ireland and other places. But in principle, huge areas of upland Ireland might gain an income stream for semi-natural reforesting from this source. So keep an eye on this sector. Education might seem odd, but most Norwegian children go to kindergarten. A third of these kindergartens are outdoors, and all of them often go out into the woods. This is my son going out and coming back, again, some years ago now. And it continues right through the period of compulsory education. And these often use accommodation or other facilities on farm properties. Cabins, very many cabins in Norway, 1 per 12 inhabitants back in 2009. Varying from things, there's a cabin called a hute in Norwegian, varying from things that in Ireland would also be called a hut to occasionally monuments to wretched excess, like the one in the on the right middle there, which is owned by a Norwegian billionaire. And they're a common feature of the landscape. They're a common piece of business activity. There's also recreation. The big beast in Norway of the environmental sector is the Hikers Association. 5% of the population are members of it. And there's a quote, this is probably the most cliched phrase in the whole of Norwegian, ut på tur aldri sur, out on tour, never unhappy, is that in formal English. It's, if you Google that, you get 392,000 hits for the exact phrase from a country that's only got 5 million people in it. And it's given serious government support. On the left there is the current Prime Minister of Norway opening Outdoor Activities Day 2022. And it's not just intangible welfare that's caused by this. There is a lot of data that doing these things improves affect, which means your mood, and cognition. The one will help keep down health costs. And the health minister of Norway was quoted as saying the best health news that he'd got was that the Hikers Association's membership has reached a record high, and cognition, which presumably helps you do your work better. So we're coming towards the end now. Your value creation on the land is really ultimately a level determined by its biological productivity. And in Ireland, in Upland Ireland, it's currently performing well below that productivity biologically and therefore economically. So it's in the interests of local communities and of the Irish government, even in the narrowest of economic terms, that a change to a landscape that's producing its potential occurs. Woodlands of the type exploited by farmers in Norway are the key element in achieving this. South West Norway provides many worked examples of how this change happened, how it's maintained, how it's used. Most of it happened in Norway unplanned. You could do it much quicker in Ireland if planning were used, things like strategic planting of seed sources, for example. The other thing is it also shows if you're getting assertions that it can't be done, they are flatly untrue. South Norway has done it. There is no reason, climatically or otherwise, that Upland Ireland can't do it. So not doing it ultimately is a choice. Though I'm not trying to suggest that Ireland just copies Norway. Both landscapes are cultural landscapes. They have been for millennia. Practice and policy have been, and they are now strong shapers, intentionally or otherwise, of what happens. But South West Norway does provide insights which can be drawn on for moving to and value creation in a more productive landscape. So what are the next steps for Ireland? Well, I am not Irish, that's up to you. It's my impression that it's not well understood in Ireland that kickstarting natural regeneration is a very cost-effective way of addressing these problems. There seems sometimes, like in Scotland, an unconscious assumption that trees won't grow unless they're planted, certainly not in upland areas, or that forest is necessarily an economic monoculture. Also, to understand that forest woodlands are naturally often open in structure, they naturally often have a rich ground layer, and they sustain wild and domestic grazers, hunting, fuel wood harvesting, recreation, in addition to timber production. The government of Ireland needs to set the policy scene for all sorts of social, environmental, health reasons and economic ones. And the EU is also very interested in, through its Green Deal, in advancing this. In particular, an area I know about is through the Horizon programme. And there are a number of cases upcoming with budgets in the 6 to 12 million euros range, which are going to be awarded to international consortiums through competitive evaluation of proposals. These need to have multiple countries in them, and some of the consortiums that are forming that I am aware of right now may be interested in Irish participation. Here's what's coming up in the 2023 February deadline. There are a number where woodland and ecological regeneration projects are baked into them, especially perhaps the one at the bottom, which is right in the middle for things that we want to do in Norway and would fit very well with a lot of the restoration schemes in Ireland. Integrative forest management for multiple ecosystem services and enhanced biodiversity. That's going to open formally sometime later this month, at which point you'll be able to find it on the EU's website. We've seen the entire text in draft, so we know what's in it. And the deadline is going to be sometime in February. 2024, a bunch of other ones coming up, and this whole pattern is going to continue into the policy change at EU level, but it's the EU does seem seriously committed to attempting to achieve this transition. So there's a couple of pictures. As you remember, these are two places in the southwest of Norway. These are our modern pictures. I've shown you a lot of income streams. I'm talking about money in particular here because most countries, politicians tend to pay more attention when you talk about that. You can talk about biodiversity, and they'll agree. You can talk about carbon sinking, and they'll agree. When they talk about money, they really start to listen. These are the same places 60 years ago. Rough grazing was the only significant economic activity, and both these areas produced, in economic terms, very much less. They also, of course, were much poorer in biodiversity, carbon sinking, all of these other things. So it's in everyone's interest, even in the narrowest economic ones, that woodland of these kinds occupy large areas in the uplands of Ireland as they once did. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Halley. This was highly interesting. If you are able to turn off the screen sharing, then
yes.
we go back to speaker view, if that's okay. That's perfect. Thank you so much. So thank you so much. This is so applicable to Ireland. We are going to invite Mr. O'Toole and Bridget Murphy to give their perspective on things, and then we will open up the evening for questions. I'm asking that everybody writes their questions in the chat so that we don't go back and forth with mics and things like that, or else through email, and I would read the emails out loud. So I invite Mr. Lorcan O'Toole, if that's okay. Lorcan, are you here?
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. Great talk. It's just like in 2016 when you come over to the Resilient Landscape Conference, you did spark a lot of interest with your talk and some of the other speakers on that day as well. I know a number of farmers picked up on it, and for example, one of the attendees was part of an EIP program up in Inishowen, the Inishowen EIP, and they've started now to introduce the concept of woodland within a grazing system in 1 or 2 farms in Inishowen. I think you've touched on a few points there, Duncan, that are probably very, very relevant over here. You'll know them from Scotland, and I think what you said there about this mindset, how our landscape was, and in Ireland culturally there's a huge focus on livestock and the mythology of livestock, but the mythology of native woodland is very often buried. You know, there's really interesting story of Bree Major in Tuchwark Aitne, or the Wooing of Eton, and Bree Major is a famous hero, and he's asked to, as a challenger, a gesh, he's asked to replant large parts of Cavan. So I think even in the Bronze Age, Duncan, people in Ireland were told through myth, which will be half truth or quarter truth, whatever it might be, that there were problems, and probably flooding and loss of soil. And as you amply outlined there visually, you know, some of these bare rock landscapes in Norway or Ireland, they're not traditional. Maybe in a tourism sense, we might have a view, oh, they're very stark and romantic, but you know, really they indicate over exploitation of the uplands. I think there's some great work going on. There was Dr. Julie Fawcett, unfortunately passed away recently, but herself and maybe the likes of Professor Mick O'Connell down in NUIG, they're looking at the pollen now of woodlands, and they're coming up with some really interesting things. And I think the deforestation, Duncan, probably goes back as far as the loss of elm pollen between 4,300 BC and 3,300 BC. They can't quite explain it, but that happened all across Northwest Europe, very well documented. And here in Ireland, Julie Fawcett, when she did her PhD in West Donegal, she had 3 sample sites looking at pollen, and she found that the Scots pine seemed to fill that gap. But even the Scots pine started going to decline between 1700 BC and 400 BC. So I think, you know, the loss of woodlands in some parts of Ireland is so old that maybe that connectivity has been lost earlier here than maybe parts of Scotland and Norway. But as you outlined, there's so many good reasons to look at natural regeneration on that conference in 2016, you'll remember John Mulgrew from Scotland talking about the native regeneration outside Aberfoyle. And I have discussed it with some people in the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and I think the debate still hasn't been had openly as to which areas of the uplands we should look for natural regeneration. And there might be a nervousness that some of the designated SAC sites might lose their qualifying interest. But equally, prior to Brexit, the Scottish government were in discussion with the EU that maybe some of those designations, they were locking in habitat types that really, in the interest of the planet and maybe Europe and other cultural and issues of that nature, may need to be looked at again, because Ireland should have a lot more native woodland, particularly in the uplands. And interestingly, there is a cultural nervousness here, Duncan, as you probably hinted at toward the end. There are a lot of damp, rushy fields across Western Ireland in particular. And even if there were to be lightly wooded trees amongst those fields, I think Andrew there could give you better examples. That might be in the farmer's interest. It's going to be a slow process moving from a livestock dependency. The older farmers would suggest that there was a mixed farm economy prior to joining the EEC in 1973. They had much more of an idea of what their property could yield. And it wasn't just livestock, but they were kind of, by policymakers or decisions or economies or whatever, they were forced into three different avenues, whether it be dairy, dry stock or sheep. And as you hinted at, Duncan, this kind of need to look at a broader approach to the landscape. Interestingly, I don't, maybe because a lot of people aren't Gaelgoers, but in the Department of Agriculture, its initial title after independence was on Ryan Tallawichta. Now, anyone, I challenge you to go into your O'Donnell dictionary. Tallawichta means kind of looking after the earth and terrestrial, much more than agriculture, as you rightly suggest. But a lot of that has been lost over 20 or 30 years' time. And I think it really is up to the policymakers now, whether the policymakers are big business or departmental chiefs or financial experts, they really do have to take a broader outlook. And if we look at Ireland in the last 120 years, you know, largely even here on the west coast of Ireland, we've lost almost completely our traditional ways of even arable planting. You know, farming in Donegal now means livestock. It doesn't even mean arable. So it's another step to go from livestock plus arable plus forestry, as you rightly say, in a manner that suits the landowner themselves. Now, maybe Bridget will be able to comment on the farming side of it, but there are some commonages in Ireland, for example, that aren't drawing down any payments. And that would look like, if the commonage shareholders were in agreement, that could be an area with approval from the National Parks and Wildlife Service. They might be very suitable for regeneration programs. But there are changes, Duncan, and I would suggest you could maybe get in touch with the likes of Dr. Jenny Roach in NPWS, who has been appointed since you were making inquiries with Dennis and others in NPWS a number of years ago about the Horizon programs. But she's really doing a lot of great work, and there's a lot of good things going to happen now in Glenveigh National Park in Donegal. So I think, again, Duncan, if you're going forward and looking for partners, if you were to go back to, you could speak to Philip or Eamon, maybe try and get in contact with NPWS's new woodland specialist, Dr. Jenny Roach. But thanks again, Duncan, for giving us that talk. A lot of food for thought. And like 6 years ago, we're still slow to get out of the blocks and learn this, but the likes of Andrew and Yona and others are bringing this to the fore. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks. A couple of points on what you said. One thing that some ecological restoration has been underway in Scotland now for about 30 years or so. And a lot of, for example, Glenfeshie, and a lot of people at the start who thought it could never happen or were against it, now say they always thought what a great idea it was. And that's one of the reasons you really need to have something like the Forest of Orkney as an example on the ground that people can actually see. People always take time to come around to ideas. And having something that shows what is possible can be very, very helpful in that respect. And there's a lot of room in Ireland where something like that could at least be pioneered and tested. So I would suggest that that's probably the first way to go. A subsidiary one, which can't work nearly as well, but is nevertheless useful, is if possible to visit the southwest of Norway and see it for yourself. I've been taking groups from Scotland over for 6, 7, 8 years now. However, I've now just done my last one. That's another casualty of Brexit, because the funding mechanism is now dried up. But it's always, when I've brought people there, it's massively more useful than telling them about it. They're always going on, if they're from the biological side, about the biodiversity, about how rich the understory is, things of that sort. And they can see these farms and other things working for themselves. And remember, these areas were deforested for millennia as well. Largely complete by the Bronze Age is an exact quote from the main Norwegian research on this subject. But the farmers have now well adapted to the new system, and they certainly wouldn't want to go back to the old one.
Thank you so much, Dr. Halley. We're going to invite Bridgie Murphy to tell us a little bit about the agricultural side of things, and then we have a few good questions coming in that I will be reading afterwards. Bridgie?
Great. Well, Duncan, thank you very much for that presentation. I keep getting a wee bit distracted at my head here with this thing, but I deliberately put this photograph in the background for people to get some sort of a picture of my farm. So I'm going to come back into focus there, but I mean, I get so excited kind of hearing what you're talking about, seeing wood in quantity and not just looking at it as part of a farm's income strategy, but a primary use of sections of our hills and our uplands. My hill ecosystem has got sections of wetland, it's got sections of heath, it's got sections of Atlantic blanket bog. I've got sections of trees, as you can see there. Funnily enough, my great-great-great-grandfather planted the tree-lined fields that you can see sort of to the right of my head there. And then heading up, further, there's the permanent pasture, and then right up into the mountain kind of territory where there's cliffs up at the top with a lot of rock and streams, etc. But I am going through a wee transition on my farm at the moment, taking it out of the 20 years that I've been farming it, and certainly the loads and loads and loads of, well, actually it's generations of my family hill sheep farming up on the mountain. I am diversifying the income streams, and I really enjoyed listening to what you were saying about livelihoods and income streams, because yes, that might get politicians to listen, but it's actually what gets farmers to transition, Basically, farmers are trying to make a livelihood off of their land, and in some senses, we do need to shift to where the opportunities are, and the opportunities just aren't there at this stage in sheep. So I'm diversifying the income streams to bees, wild meadow flower seeds. I'm registered organic for that because I want to farm away from fossil fuels and chemicals. And then the other component I want to put back onto the farm in much greater numbers is trees. Trees in the form of orchards, a lot of fruit, a lot of nuts, a lot of berries, one for potential diversification, but at the moment, just food for nature. Trees too in the form of native woodland or shelter belts in places where this is the best fit within the ecosystem. And then trees to form connective corridors between your different kind of wooded habitat. So after listening to your experience and looking at my situation, there's a couple of observations I'd kind of like to make in this kind of transition I'm doing. And the first is that we have to start with ecosystems and whole ecosystems. And we need to look at whole systems approaches when we look at regenerating these ecosystems. And as I've already mentioned, we need to connect these up. Quality, quantity, and connectivity matter. I think that came out of the, was it Nature for CAP or something a couple of years ago, the high nature value research. But it really is important. Wherever we're putting this stuff in, it does need to connect itself to each other. We need a huge shift here in Ireland in our behavior and our attitude, and we need to see that reflected in policy. And I suppose the we that I'm talking about here is for all layers and levels of stakeholders in land use and agriculture, from the farmer to the department to academia to business. The changing of this kind of behavior, or what I'm talking about here, is I'm kind of referring to flipping the current situation where the business as usual for farming is about farmers being encouraged to carry on with productive and competitive behavior, and to change the environment around us by allowing little bits and pieces here of the different components to exist without a penalty of ineligibility, but essentially the basis still remains the same. The penalty for ineligibility, if people don't know that, I'll come on to that in a minute. But I mean, I think we also need to soften up on the need to control and to start allowing or trusting nature to know what she's doing. And of course, we also need to learn a whole bunch more about what nature is doing and why this is happening. I mean, we know that nature can recover or regenerate when she's left to do it. But something I've learned from participating in and project managing a soil biodiversity EIP for Talamh Beo is that certain interventions are needed to allow certain processes to happen that bit more quickly. And for those unfamiliar with Talamh Beo, by the way, it would be Ireland's agroecological farm organization. But an example that I'm talking about here with the soil is the amount of and relationship or the ratio between, say, for example, fungi and bacteria, which is essential for feeding plants and trees. And sometimes after we've depleted all of the soil biodiversity or decimated it with chemicals and compaction, we can give nature a hand introducing stock and amendments. And those type of amendments being things like, into the soil, compost teas, adding back in soil organic matter. But for this to happen, we need to kind of stop and observe and learn more about the nature of what we're farming and test it out more and remediate. And the last point, and I mentioned just before, the whole thing of eligibility and agricultural activity, I think we really need to widen how we define agricultural activity if we want farmers to shift in a direction of putting in more trees. We have to start looking beyond livestock tillage and horticulture being the only valid agricultural activities. Nature doesn't have these kind of like very clear divides as well when policy comes out, where they talk about there's going to be agriculture here and there's going to be forestry there and there's going to be a bit of wetland policy here and a bit of water policy there. In practice on the ground, it's all happening as one piece. So that goes back to what I was saying about the ecosystems and the whole system approach. But specifically, I think as long as agroforestry and trees take land out of agricultural activities definition, many farmers are going to resist going in that direction, because everybody knows that the money kind of follows the agricultural production rather than the forestry or the wetland or the carbon sequestration. We can also kind of look at opening up more agricultural activities, for example, local production of seeds and tree nurseries, providing stock for self-seeding, and Duncan mentioned there strategic places of seed sources. And we really do need to have them local. You know, the last thing, I mean, we brought in ash dieback by bringing that back in, you know, planting it outside the country and bringing it back in. But if we had smaller nurseries dotted around all over the country rather than one or two massive nurseries, the spread of things like disease or the vectors that would spread that could be limited a lot more. And finally, I think we need to kind of widen the net of livestock when we're talking about farming. We need to look, say, for example, at bees becoming a livestock unit, and to make sure that we don't make the mistake that we did with cattle and sheep, where we just outcompeted anything that belonged to nature. We would have to look at bees with margins for wild pollinators built into that. But we need to look at diversification of livelihoods of grazers and grazing regimes. And I do think that if we can open up those spaces, the hill and the uplands ecosystems would start kind of responding to that. But perhaps I can kind of stop there for now and see what you think.
Yeah, my problem with answering any of these things, I agree with pretty much everything you say, is that I am not a farmer. I'm a city boy, in fact, and I can tell you what has happened in Norway, and it's a complex cultural event. Most of it was unplanned. Most of this regeneration just happened because of other social and economic changes, which we then used. It could be achieved much faster in Ireland if it was planned, since availability of seed sources is what the data shows is the major factor. But it is a cultural landscape, was and has been for millennia, just like Ireland. And what we're really talking about here, it seems to me, is what the optimal realized cultural landscape is. It would appear to me that if we're talking here about the upland areas of Ireland, if they did not exist the way they were, you certainly wouldn't invent them. They can certainly produce, even in the economic term, and certainly in biological terms, their productivity could be very much higher than it is now. The problem is achieving that transition, and that has to be done partly by persuading people and partly by having mechanisms in the society. At the moment, there are a fair number of perverse ones which make things worse rather than better. And as ever, again, like I said with the last one, the main thing in the short run, I think, is creating facts on the ground so that people can actually see them. And then, as is starting to happen in Scotland, a lot of people will remember what a good idea they thought it was 30 years ago. So if it were possible to do a large restoration of an area of upland Ireland so that people can see what the new system would look like, that's probably the best way to go in the short term.
Thank you so much, Dr. Halley. We have a good few questions here. I will just read them in the order that they came in. Sure. So the first one is from Alan Mee. He says, great talk, Duncan, an excellent model for woodland recovery in Ireland. The missing element in your talk are large predators and natural as opposed to hunting regulations of grazers. It seems from the rate of recovery of woodland in Norway that hunting is sufficient to replace predators. Is hunting, legal or illegal, the main reason that large predators don't figure as main regulators of herbivores in Norway?
Yeah, well, I'm talking here about West and South West Norway, and in that region, all of the large predators are functionally extinct. The population of all of the herbivores, domestic or wild, is regulated by people, either through for domestic herbivores just by stocking numbers, and for wild herbivores through the hunting system. There are complex reasons for this. Norway, I think I would go so far as to say that Norway has the worst large predator management in the whole of Europe. It's a horrifying dysfunctional nightmare, which pleases nobody, costs a great deal of money, and continually ratchets up social tension. So, but in the western part of Norway, both wolves and bears have not reached there again. There are small numbers of lynx and wolverine, but they're nowhere near at natural densities. And neither of those would predate larger wild herbivores like red deer. Lynx are roe deer specialists, and wolverine are not active predators of large animals. So the fact is that we manage our system and we get our regeneration through, in part, our regulation of the number of herbivores. Either some of it happened for economic reasons, people just don't keep that many animals anymore because of social and economic changes, domestic. But in the case of the wild herbivores, they are regulated through the hunting system. If anyone is really interested in that, I can give them a very detailed presentation on it if they just send me an email as to how we achieve this. But that's how it's done. And in practical terms for Ireland, where all the large predators are extinct, and I presume there is no practical possibility of them being reintroduced anytime in the next decades, then examples of management of wild herbivores where they are kept at densities that allow regeneration can be useful. And as the Norwegian example shows, you can in fact extract just as many animals out of the landscape if the hunting management is done right and get regeneration, as compared to, say, places like Scotland, where you have large areas that are run for the sole purpose of keeping red deer, but the numbers there are so high that regeneration of woodland is precluded, and the general sward is in very poor condition.
Thank you so much. Elaine Doyle has a number of questions that I'm going to be reading. So the first one would be, I'm speaking to educators around formal qualification for training foresters in Ireland and the UK and looking at funding system. Are you familiar with other programs which could inspire a good training model?
Well, the short answer to that is no. I don't live in Ireland. I haven't lived in Britain for 30 years, and Norway is not in the European Union, though it is in the European Economic Area. So while there are qualifications in Norway, I doubt they would be applicable to the Irish situation.
Thank you. The second question would be, have any studies been done around carbon sink difference between Sitka spruce and broadleaf trees that you are aware of? Yes,
I did show a picture there of a document produced in Norway, carbon sinking in Norwegian ecosystems, it's called. It goes into that kind of question in some detail. And the data indicates that natural forests, especially when they are older, are more efficient carbon sinks than Sitka spruce stands are. This can get complicated depending on what you put in and what you put out, but Sitka spruce stands are generally being used for clear fell rotation. And when that's the case, most of the carbon that they sink gets released pretty within a decade or so of them being harvested. So you end up with not all that much in the way of carbon sinking as well. In addition, in Norway, the carbon and biodiversity crises are legally linked. You're not allowed, as it were, to discuss the one without the other. And solving the carbon problem while making the biodiversity problem worse is not a policy option that is on the table in Norway, and densely planted Sitka spruce are not good for biodiversity. But in sheer mass of carbon sinking, a more diverse woodland, especially when it gets to older ages, is a better carbon sink than a Sitka plantation.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go to the third question. How badly damaged are soils that are treated with pesticides and herbicides, and how long do they need to regenerate, etc.?
I'm not qualified to answer the question. This is the short answer there. That's not my, it's not my area. It's one of the things I have been wanting to have researched in Norway is in fact what happens to the soils when this process of regeneration takes place. You can find everything in Norway, from places that have now had woodland on them again for a century to places which are still unforested moorland. It's completely open to structured research if I could find someone to do it and I could get the funding. The problem in Norway is that it's not our problem, so domestic sources of funding won't pay to study known problems. And in certainly in Scotland so far, Scotland is not willing to fund anything outside Scotland, no matter how apposite it might be. If Ireland is more enlightened in this respect, then research in South West Norway is absolutely possible to do serious structured research on this. It's a thing I would love someone to do. And again, there is the possibility of the EU's Marie Curie postdoc program. If you know someone who's recently got a PhD and is really good at soil science and would like to come to Norway at Norwegian rates of pay for 2 years, put them in touch with me.
Thank you so much. The last question from Elaine was, are countries collaborating on the Horizon funding?
Yes, the Horizon, it is required by the Horizon program, this part of it, the area that's called the Societal Challenges program. That's the one that puts out these big research projects. There must be at least 3 countries in it. On average, there are 9. You can't, in practice, get funded for one of these. If you look at the way these calls are structured, they pretty much require you to have people from most of the regions of Europe involved in them. So, so one of the things that you have to do when you're devising these projects is you have to get your consortium right, and it has to be pretty broad, and it also has to be good. So at the moment, we know these calls are coming out, and various people in NINA who are interested in various calls are now trying to see how they can get into or form a credible consortium. If you can do that, then the amount of writing you have to do is actually quite small. It's the people at the top who are writing these 7, 8, 10 million projects, generally big institutions, that have to do most of the work. The bit that you have to put in is a couple of paragraphs on the actual project, the actual part of the project that you're doing and you're an expert in. So the amount of input can be relatively limited, and the amount of money you get back can be relatively large. The main problem is the competition. So it's important to make sure that you're in with one of the big credible consortiums. If you're not in one of those, you've had it from the start. Though I can advertise at NINA, we're pretty good at finding out who these big consortiums are. We've had a fair amount of experience in it.
Sorry, thanks. If I may come in, thanks, Duncan, and thanks people for the questions. There's a couple of other questions there. One from Neville Kilkenny, and it's saying, given that Ireland is known for its peat-rich soils, are you aware of the recent research published last year by Stirling University showing that the introduction of birch and pine plots and their associated ECM fungi into ericoid communities after 35 years resulted in up to 50% loss of soil organic carbon stores?
Yeah, I'm aware of that research is coming out suggesting that there is loss over what is in fact a relatively short timescale in the evolution of a forest. Even 35 years is, in carbon sinking terms, it's only just getting going. And so the same is true with the soil development. So if you're going to look at that seriously, you have to look at it as to what will happen over if the forest matures.
Okay.
A thing that is researchable again in South West Norway, but I've so far failed to persuade anyone to get it funded. The problem with the Scottish research again is it's I'll be brutal, it's parochial.
Okay.
They need to look more internationally and find out what happens over a longer scale. That said, there are also plenty of places in Ireland that do not have peat soils, plenty of rocky mountains in Ireland, that if you're concerned about that, you can get going elsewhere in the meantime. And using it as a sort of showstopper would be, it seems to me, unwise. My experience has been from Scotland again, that mostly you hear about those sorts of research, which are selected out really rather selectively by people who are opposed to regeneration for other reasons. Those reasons might be legitimate. You might like that kind of landscape, but selecting certain parts of the data and not others isn't really the scientific way to go. I am not suggesting the person that asked that question is doing that, by the way, though it is something I'm familiar with from Scotland. And we all know in most parts of walks of life, people do tend to select the data that is most comfortable to their gut feeling.
Yeah, so that research is not thinking in tree time terms of the tree time, human time is very short.
Total evolution of the entire it's looking at a bunch of birches mostly growing over a relatively short period. It's not looking either at the development of the woodland in the long term, and you saw in one of
as
my
an ecosystem
that other things like oaks and hazel were succeeding through, and also to the long-term effects on the soil, because there's the leaf fall which gets incorporated through the roots into the soil. There is data on this again in that Norwegian carbon sequestration in Norwegian ecosystems, which indicates clearly that older woodlands are very much more effective at sinking carbon.
Andrew, could I just say there as well, Duncan, you may not be aware of it, like I have heard people raise that, and a very valid issue, whether an active bogland is better than regeneration. But I think where the focus is starting to narrow in on is that exposed rock and also exposed and degraded peatlands. There are a lot of degraded open peat hags in the Irish uplands that won't be comparable to the figures that gentleman referenced there from the Sterling research. So there are areas in the uplands that wouldn't even fit that kind of either or, and progress could be made in those degraded areas, exposed peat hags and bare rock.
Yes. And just again, we are running, we're nearly at 9 o'clock, and thanks everybody for hanging in there. I don't know if do people want to go on for another 10 minutes, and also there is a question that if woodland is used as a carbon sink, but much wood used as firewood, how much does that take from its carbon sequestration overall? That's a good question in regard to the use of firewood, and also that there's a lot of people and even politicians who are of the view that we should not be burning wood as fuel in this country, which has possible implications again for the management of regenerated native woodlands, because the main source of income would be coming from thinnings for firewood that would be replacing fossil fuels. So if you could maybe cover that, and sorry for cutting across you, Duncan, if you were going to respond further to
that's fine. Yeah, if you burn firewood, of course, it releases carbon. In Norway, rather under 10% of the regrowth is used for this purpose. So the overall balance is enormously towards sequestration. And of course, if you use fuel wood, you may be replacing other things that are emitting fossil fuels. So, and if it's grown for the purpose and then harvested, it is at least carbon neutral over its cycle. So yeah, the better way, if you wish, one way you can deal with this is to deliberately forego the use of fuel wood, in which case you will sequester more carbon more quickly. How the policy balance works out best, because of course having the money from fuel wood is a reason for farmers to have the woodland. If you've got a woodland in place where you had none before, then in most places that's going to be an overall increase in the carbon store. And there's also the carbon store in the soils, which is typically larger than in the woodland itself. And that's held down by the woodland.
Thank you. Were there any new questions come in, or?
I saw a question about rhododendron. I actually spent yesterday killing some rhododendron in the first really nasty little outbreak that we've got in Norway. It's a matter of time, because Norway didn't have big landowners who planted lots of rhododendron hybrids out in the Victorian period and afterwards. The only Norwegians in rural districts only got to have it in the 1960s. So what we have is an incipient problem, but we can strangle it at birth. And in fact, this is a point where I can say thank you very much to the population of Ireland, because among other things, the method we are using to kill them comes directly from methods developed in Ireland as published by Killarney National Park. But since we've only got a few thousand of them in our first outbreak, we have a reasonable prospect of killing them all. So we have been using Ireland and Scotland as a warning to the rest, to Norway, and pointing out that what now is just a few thousand plants, look what happens if you leave them. So that one, thanks to experience in Ireland and Scotland, it looks like we are probably going to be able to prevent it from getting to be serious.
Okay. Well, that's great news. There were two more questions, actually three, to keep coming in. One was from James, and he was saying, brilliant talk, Duncan. Are there any detailed maps of Norway from the 1800s? And if so, are these easily accessible online? Is ancient woodland a concept in Norway like it is in Ireland? Are there any woodland associated species that are yet to spread from ancient into more recent woodlands?
Yeah, maps from the period are not very good to be, they're there, but they indicate a woodland by a kind of handwritten little tree figure, and it's almost impossible to know what that actually meant on the ground. It certainly wasn't systematic. So we don't really have good enough maps to do anything terribly useful with before the 20th century. What was the second part of the question? Can you remind me?
Yes, just give me 1 second. It was if the ancient woodlands are a concept in Norway like it is in Ireland, and if there are any woodland associated species that are yet to spread from ancient into more recent woodlands.
Right. Ancient woodland, yeah, we have two categories. One is ancient woodland urskog, that means really pristine, unaffected by humans, vanishingly rare. We've also got another one called naturskog, or natural woodland, which means its processes are largely naturally driven, but there have been human impacts, typically through grazing and occasionally felling, and those are somewhat more common, though on the west, in the western areas we're talking about here, they are also extremely rare. It is an issue because all of these woodlands, or most of the woodlands in Norway, are really pretty young. And for a number of species, especially of invertebrates, fungi, and so on, this is a serious issue. They're specially adapted to old woodland, to dead trees, and so on. So one of the things that we are looking into, and will probably be a part of some of these EU applications, is what's called veteranizing trees. This means making them old before their time in these new woodlands that have sprung up, in order to provide, among other things, corridors between fragments of ancient or old woodland, so that many of these old species, these species that are specially adapted for them, can reach new areas along these corridors. So we are actually actively working on trying to make trees old before their time by damaging them, frankly. But we want to put that on a more solid work through basis, and that's going to be one of the elements in future Norwegian woodland management, where the government policy is to attempt to make the woodlands, including the productive forestry woodlands, more biodiverse, and that's going to mean a certain proportion of the trees being used for purposes other than timber production. One of them is quote, veteranizing them in the short term, and another one is in the long term, letting a proportion of the trees grow old and die naturally.
Thank you so much. We're going to 2 more questions, and then we're going to close it for the evening. And if anybody has more questions, they're invited to send them to us by email. So one, Bridgie was asking, what has the impact of ash dieback been on the woodlands there?
Ash is distributed around the coast of Norway, up around about as far as Trondheim, or North Trondheim's where I live. It's the same latitude as Reykjavik in Iceland. It's ongoing. It's arrived and it's killing the ash trees really quite fast. The long-term effects of this remain to be seen. It's a bit behind the stage that certainly is the case in Great Britain. I don't know what it's like in Ireland.
Thank you. We're going to take the last question from Geert, and then I would like to invite, for the closing, Andrew to talk a little bit. You were referring about the Forest of Octi, and maybe just as a closing, to bring it back to our vision for Ireland and how we can weave these 2 visions together. So the last question was, is there any experience in Norway with state forestry stepping back a few steps and surrendering coniferous plantation in favor of deciduous regeneration?
Most of the forestry resource in Norway is not in state ownership. It's 80% of it is owned by farmers. 20% of it is, and talking in area terms, 20% is owned by forestry companies, of which the state forestry company is one. General policy is to encourage a more diverse use of woodland and encourage biodiversity, and various policy mechanisms are being developed to that end. But it's an area that is in active development at the moment. But the policies in the future are likely to include things like allowing some trees to live to older areas, going over to more continuous cover forestry. Interestingly, Oslo is surrounded by a large amount of forest. The climate is different from Ireland. When you get to Oslo, it's relatively more continental, colder winters, warm summers. But they've gone over for amenity reasons. Most of it's owned by Oslo Council. They went over to a continuous cover model from an earlier area clearfell measure. And the numbers coming out suggest that it is as profitable as the old system. But also the data is very clear that it's much better for all the other reasons that they want. For the amenity reasons, it's also much better for biodiversity. And with a few tweaks, it could be a great deal better soon. Still, so the data there looks very interesting. And there's a big debate in Norwegian forestry about it on the subject now, because the numbers seem pretty strong. On the other hand, a lot of the retiring generation of foresters who learned a very production-oriented method remain skeptical of it.
Thank you so much for tonight, Dr. Halley and Lord O'Toole and Bridgie Murphy. And I would like to thank everybody. I'm going to invite Andrew to give us a couple of closing words, and then we can wrap up for the night, because we're only almost an hour over time.
My apologies.
Yeah, well, it shows the level of interest, and thanks again for everybody. And I think I'd just like to make a quick point about the succession, the natural succession, which is starting to happen in some of those new woodlands in Norway, where the oaks and the hazel are coming in. And that's a very important aspect of natural regeneration, to allow that to start happening, which will speed up the ecological value of those woodlands, and also bring in the specialist species that you will have in ancient woodlands, and create the conditions for those to thrive. And here, we have we have new woodlands being put in, native woodlands, where canopy species are going in, with pioneer species. And we should be looking at more, following the succession, putting in our pioneers and bringing in our canopy species when the pioneers have done their work and have actually prepared the site for the canopy species. And also we have a problem with not enough protection to new woodlands on sites for between grazing and also storms and wind being a big problem, trying to regenerate our woods. With the Great Forest of Ockley projects, we did join with Nina back in 2013. We were honoured to be invited to be part of a Horizon 2020 funding application to look at upland restoration in 5 countries. I think it was Portugal, Scotland, Ireland, Norway, and I forget what the 5th.
Slovakia.
Unfortunately, because of the competition Duncan referred to, we didn't make we got to the 2nd round, but we might have another go again, hopefully. And the project at the moment is mainly happening with individuals cooperating with bringing their land back towards native woodland in the Ockley. We would like to work with partners. We've started conversations with National Parks Wildlife Service. We have tried to involve Quilcha in assisting, and we think they could do an awful lot more, and hopefully they will. But for the moment, as I say, the project is mainly happening with individual kind of projects. It's a 100 square mile area. I put in information there into the chat. But we've also, in the first webinar, the presentation, and I know some of those slides didn't work out very well. Apologies for that. But there is a map from the 1500s, and that map shows Ireland with about 25% woodland cover. And that map shows the other areas of Ireland where communities can find the footprint of their Great Forest of Ockley. So if we can get the Forest of Ockley going as a pilot, well, then we have the outline for other communities to get involved and find the footprints and create this matrix idea of corridors connecting existing ancient woodlands, semi-natural woodlands, hedgerows, shelter belts, and create a matrix across the land for aiming for about 30% woodland cover, which is the amounts or percentage that the European biodiversity strategy, I think, is looking for, or restoration, 30%. And that links in, I think, with ecologists and with George Peterkin, his work, where he said that if you can achieve 30% in an area, a large area, well, then you're getting close to self-sustaining the woodland. And again, I suppose the other point is we need to be looking at woodlands as a part of a whole ecosystems way. We need ecological management, we need ecological thinking, and we need to be thinking in tree time, very, very long term, like the minimum 100 years in our planning. And we need integration of policy and planning. So look, thank you. And look forward to maybe more questions or more connections or people signing up or following up. And thanks again to CELT, who are supporting and involved with the Great Forest of Ockley as well. And thanks for the opportunity. So good luck.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye and good night, everyone.
Yeah, and we hope to see you again, Duncan.
I'll be back if I
or
can.
we'll bring a group over to you.
Come over here. I mean, seriously.
We'd love to.
As long as you stay out of restaurants and hotels, it's quite cheap.
Yeah. Okay, we will. We will indeed.
Okay. Good night then.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Bye.